Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. And really what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what do developers want from application security training. We've got some amazing panelists that are going to be joining us today. And so we invite you as we're going through this, don't hesitate, ask questions. This is a community effort. Last time we had a similar webinar, there were lots and lots of folks that asked some very interesting questions, and let's try and learn from each other. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand from a developer's perspective, how can we help developers to go in there and embrace security, really try to influence them. Now, before we get started, I just want you to know that all of the thoughts, opinions expressed in this webinar today are those of the respective speakers. They don't necessarily reflect those of the organizations. And with that, let's kick it off. I think it makes sense for us to, first of all, introduce all of our panelists. I'll just go down the screen that I've got here. So Tanya, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tanya Skinner, and I'm the Director of Product Security Assurance at Western Digital. Prior to Western Digital, I was at AWS, and prior to that, I was at Intel for a very long time. I like to say I grew up at Intel as they hired me out of college. I started my journey as a software engineer at Intel, and now I'm one of the dreaded product security folks. And I'm here to help hopefully raise that bar on security assurance across everything.
Fabulous. Sounds good. Spencer?
Yeah, so I'm Spencer Koch. I'm a principal security engineer here at Reddit. Kind of in the security architecture, jack of all trades, running everything from for a 16-year-old startup, which is a lot of fun. Prior to this, I was a CISO at an energy company in Houston. And before that, I was one of the dreaded consultants at a Big Four that did cybersecurity.
Sounds good. And Mark, you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, hey, good morning, everyone. So my name is Mark Timms. I am a senior behavioral science researcher at one of Canada's big 5 banks. Everybody can look it up. I've actually worked at a couple of banks in Canada, as well as spent the last decade plus working in the field of changing or impacting or shaping individual decision making. So my passion is actually why people make decisions. My profession is measuring change. And I spend the better part of my time, most of my days, figuring out ways to help people make smarter decisions without realizing that they're making smarter decisions. Over to you.
Awesome. Sounds good. And Paul, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'm Paul Bruce. I am head of incubation engineering at a company called Tricentis that focuses on a lot of the quality engineering elements that are in Fortune 1000s. I also organize a lot of the DevOps stuff in the Boston area. That's where I live. And also, I care a lot about other aspects of software lifecycle, like, for instance, we call it observability now, but the ability to understand what's happening in your systems and make sure that that information has got to the right place. I also like, if I can just import the last parts of what Mark said about how to help people make better decisions. So the incubation stuff is super early work and internal stuff. But as we go about this, the work that I do and the work that my team does, we're not exempt from security. It may never see the light of day, but we still have to adhere to good security principles in whatever we do, because we don't always know where it's going to go. And we want to make sure that we are also patterning the behaviors that we want. So I've been developing for a long time and crewing a lot of tech debt in my almost 20 plus years of doing professional software development. But mostly just a friend of Altez, and definitely talk with a lot of developers these days.
Wonderful. Sounds good. So there you have it, folks. Please don't hesitate. Let the questions come in. See what we can do to help work through them as well. So we did a survey at Security Compass, right? And we actually asked those in the dev space, how frequently do you look up a security topic? And what we found from the response that we got was about 28% of the managers, about 20% of individuals, and all the way down to like regularly once a week, almost half, sometimes over half of the people in the development space are looking up security topics. So it is something that is in their radar. developers are looking to understand what security is. But let me pop the question, and I'll start with you, Tanya. From your perspective, have you found that security is something that developers are interested in and are spending time looking up security topics?
That's such a loaded question. I think yes, I think developers are, and they are looking. I think finding the answer they're looking for, though, can be a challenge. But I think there's also the case of, do we correctly define what is a security topic? Do they understand when this defect that they're looking at has security implications? And I think that's part of the gap that we need to figure out how to bridge, is helping them figure out, yes, this is a defect, but it's not just a functional defect, it's also a security issue. And I think when they realize it's a security issue, people can Google and search and look and go talk to resources. But one of the bigger gaps is helping them have the background such that they can recognize, in fact, this is potentially a security issue.
Interesting. Spencer, you've got some thoughts on this?
Yeah, like I'm always a big fan of not necessarily treating security issues as a special class. Like this doesn't surprise me, the amount of folks Googling things. Like people Google how to do simple development topics as well. So security is just a flavor that we particularly care about as practitioners that have a different risk impact, not necessarily from a product perspective, but from a security perspective. So I'm not surprised by this at all. I think just like you shouldn't copy and paste anything directly off of Stack Overflow, there's a lot of bad answers out there from a security perspective. And so it's like, how do we get people the right answers and the consistent answers within your organization, like how it relates to you, right? Like usage of internal libraries that codify how these answers should be done. Like there's a lot of different things and ways that we can institutionalize that knowledge. But that I see often is the gap of, I've got this problem, I kind of know like what SSRF is, or maybe like how to do CSRF, like these acronyms that maybe make sense to a developer, maybe they don't. But making sure that we can connect to those two, like I feel like that's my responsibility as a security practitioner, is how do I connect that info up as someone who knows that, has that body of knowledge crammed into their head.
Sounds good. Excellent. And Mark, you've been working on this for some time as well. Can you offer your thoughts on security and how developers are in fact looking for security information? Has that been your experience as well, or is there a gap in there?
I mean, I'll call that like a fundamentally sort of dangerous question. Maybe dangerous is the right word, but if you start out, like humans are only actively seeking knowledge that they suspect exists, right? You don't need advanced behavioral science credentials to know that. So the idea that a developer is actively looking up security concerns too much or too little suggests to me that there's an absence of security integrations into the workplace culture, right? So if a developer is at the last second, like thinking, how can I make this safe? The company that developer works for has left it in the hands of the developing teams or development teams that may or may not actually come up with the right answers or come up with the best answers for that company in that time. So I would argue that, that developers are, searching, for security solutions or security workarounds is exactly as my colleague just said. We're always looking up all kinds of things all the time. But if you really want them to be safe, you don't leave it to the developers who may or may not look it up right at the moment of truth, right? You got to weave it into the corporate culture so that it's already done and easy for the developer from my perspective.
Sounds good. I'm going to just ping Paul now. I mean, Paul, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would echo that too. But my framing is like you got to balance the reactive versus proactive approach to this. In the sense that to the point is like, during an incident is like the last place you want to be going from 0 to 125 kilometers per hour about a topic that's not new to you. On the other hand, trying to do everything proactively, like boil the ocean, like, staring into the void of all the things you don't know. How do you justify that time spend, even if you do find something? Going back to, I think, one of the topics brought up was, how do we at least help somebody have a mental trigger for the moment that it's like, is this secure? Should I put this lens on this? Should I think about it from this different direction? Even if they're coming in, like if I can ally for a second with maybe some of the junior devs that might be watching this. If we as junior devs don't, like, we just got started, like it's been the first couple of years of our career, and we haven't really approached some of these like really problematic and dangerous circumstances yet. But how are we surrounded by context that allows us to at least have a trigger moment that kind of says, maybe I should have somebody else look at this, maybe a person on your team, or maybe as you develop relationships with some of the AppSec people, hopefully positive relationships, that it's easy to kind of ping over to them and say, hey, could we do a quick, could I just have like 15 minutes of your time to take a look at this at the right time today? That's more going into surrounding yourself with context, but also that context that the organization puts around you and sets you up for success, as opposed to just not knowing and just not doing these things. So I think it really is a balance of reactively, you don't know what you don't know, right? And there are going to be things that come up, and you're going to learn, quote, on the job, which isn't the same as it used to be. It's kind of like just throw you into the mold. But on the proactive side, if the approach is just, we're never going to learn about things that don't directly apply to the work right now, right here, sprint by sprint, sort of horse blinders, myopic view, that sets you up for a world of hurt in the actual moments of incident. Hopefully those happen less frequently.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I'd like to pull on that a little bit, because I've heard context a few times now, in this discussion we've had. So this idea that we want to, first of all, help to understand the context of our architecture. But even when we look at the context of the flow, where we are in the DevOps, sort of the pipeline, and how we inject security into that, many times we've heard that security hasn't actually kept up, and development moves really, really quickly. So, I'm coming in as a developer. I'm really challenged to push stuff out the door. I now have to come in there and think about security. I'm going to try look something up real quick, figure out what I need to do the best I can, and move forward. Are we advocating for something that, maybe a place that I can go look something up that accommodates the speed at which I need to move as a developer? Is this part of the challenge here? Are there ways that we can do that, to address this pain that the developers are facing around, I want to go quickly, and I can't have something step in my way here. How do we get over this hurdle of getting security to move fast? Are there techniques? Are there things that we can do? Spencer, you've actually gone from security to dev to security, and you've gone kind of back and forth. What are your thoughts on this? Any insights you can offer?
Yeah, this one's tricky because there's a lot of culture that's wrapped up in this. Like, obviously, so working at Reddit, like, we are very quick out the door. Like, we ship features all day, like every hour, things are leaving. And so for me, like, that is my success as a security person, like being able to make sure that features are being shipped. And so if you're in a place that is more old school security and is like, here are the prescriptive things that have to be done, and never shall I waver on that this is the way things are going to be done, that's unfortunately a culture thing that security needs to get over, right? And like, every time I find a security practitioner that does that, they're dead to me, because it is the worst thing. It is the most crippling thing from an organization. Like, you are truly the cost center. So I view myself as providing value for my company by being able to give them that info, be able to partner with them. Like, if they need a second pair of eyes on a pull request, I need to be there and I need to make that happen. Or I need to figure out how do I make those resources available. So, like, as a principal security engineer, like, that's my job of figuring out how I can disseminate that, both my time and effort. So I think, like, I love a world where there is a security embed model. We talk a lot about security champions as the buzzword in the industry, but however you end up doing it, where there is a security minded person that, their main focus is focusing on security, not necessarily like closing Jira tasks and shipping code, but somebody that gets the time to put in their headspace security problems and solve them, but still understand the context and be in the weeds. So, like, how are they deploying? What's the product spec that they're trying to achieve? Who is their audience? All of these things matter and shape how security should be designed for that little problem. But the real challenge is that those resources are hard to find. They're extremely valuable, and everybody gobbles them up. So there's a lot of things that are like a confluence of things that make this really hard to pull off well.
Mm-hmm. I see you nodding your head, Paul. You've got some thoughts on this as well?
I'm just reminded of before the webinar, Tanya and I were talking about, how do you, especially there's a difference between software that is like web-based software and like hardware software, the bits that go on hardware. And I was trying to, drum up a quick dialogue about like, are there general principles that apply here? And one of the things that Tanya said was champions matter a lot. Now, champions, whatever you want to call them, advocates, although that gets kind of tied up into the external advocacy, but like internal advocacy is a thing too. We have some of ours at the company I work with now that really do what Spencer is suggesting, which is really try to sit and have your hands dirty with the person who's having that problem, because that's how you earn not only empathy, but you earn the context to go, maybe I do have to adjust the tutorials or the templates or the maybe if this is, a lot of companies who focus mostly on the web stuff, maybe they do get into IoT or something, and so now all of a sudden they've got a smaller division or a set of teams that deal with the specific hardware, and that might be new to them, right? Dealing with the intricacies, the very different tool chains and different technologies and languages and complexities of writing software that lives on hardware directly, as opposed to just like a web app, right? Or APIs. So I think going back to what really makes this work, first off, not to say that all problems are people problems, but tools and process are never going to take decisions that human beings aren't involved in at some point in time. So it ultimately is us that we need to figure out and how to properly apply the advocacy hours, the people that are the glue in between various people who have very specific focus, like, app or feature developer or feature team versus, hashtag DevOps or Cloud Ops or Infra Ops teams or SRE teams, stuff like that. That glue that binds those things together, that right fits, that's their work, right? That's the work of facilitating and encouraging getting people together in an effective way, right? And getting over hurdles.
Yeah, and you brought up Tanya. Tanya, you come from, a hardware background. You're dealing with developers that are in the firmware space. I'd like to get your thoughts, and then after you, I'd like to ping Mark to see, he's coming from a people-centric security perspective. I'd like to know what are some things, that he thinks that we could do around bridging this gap and really helping developers and enabling them. So Tanya, you want to go first?
Sure. So in terms of there's about 4,000 questions in what we just discussed. So I'll pick off a couple things. A couple of the themes I heard is, how do we get security integrated? How do we help developers move faster? Whether they're above the operating system, they're on, a cloud-based app, or they're, an RTL or at the firmware level, right? They're focusing on developing whatever features or functions, and then we have to add security in. And I think that's fundamentally the root cause of the problem here. Security shouldn't be this add-on. Okay, now we've done our development, now we have to add in security. In order for us to be successful, security has to be a foundational part of how we engineer. And unfortunately, that's where our educational institutions are failing us. They are putting out engineers, and security there might be an elective course on, security. You've done all this engineering work and all these engineering courses. Now let's have a little special course on security that, by the way, is not mandatory. That's the biggest problem we have to solve. Security should be integrated into every single engineering course at the university level. But I'll put aside that little mantra of mine. That's a bigger problem to solve. But in terms of how we enable and help our developers deal with security issues and security questions they have, as Paul pointed out, your centralized security team is never going to have all the context in everything you're doing, everything you're architecting, all your customer requirements, your tool chain constraints. They're never going to have all that context. So what we need to focus on from this centralized security team perspective is this is the outcome we wish to achieve, and we need champions within the development teams who understand the product development context. They understand the products and the architecture. They understand what your use cases and constraints are and how you develop. And they can help bridge that gap and help translate from, the developer question into how do we achieve this security objective. Context matters. It matters a lot, especially in making rapid decisions and giving the advice that's needed. And we have to find a way to get people embedded within the development teams who have some of the security mindset and have that context who can help drive those discussions. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, Altez.
Yep, that makes sense. And you and I have spoken at length about architecture, and that's where a lot of this context starts to enter in, right? But before we get to that, let me give Mark an opportunity here. Mark, your thoughts?
I mean, I really appreciated what Tanya was saying, and I'll hook on to the fact that no one wants one more thing that they have to think about or do at work. Like, on behalf of people everywhere, I'm happy to report, without having to cite this, everybody's doing their best, the best they can with what they have already. And what you're getting is their very best. So when a person who's not part of like the core, drivers of success or what's cool in an environment pops in out of nowhere and says, hey, I'm with security, and security is important, so you have to do all this extra security work. I've never actually seen that go well. I can't think of one example where that has like people have been like, oh, thank you, stranger, with new things for me to do. And I'll candidly tell you that even at work, okay, like I'm a behavioral science researcher in my job title, but I never show up saying, hey, folks, you know what we could add? An experiment to what we're doing. That's, in fact, I get paid to identify what is already happening and to weave experiments into the system limitations of what's already, like, what's rolling out, right? I don't show up saying, hey, y'all hired a scientist, so everybody has to get down with this, and now we'll do this extra work. You just sneak it right in. Those are my thoughts, Altaz.
Yeah, Paul, you had your hand raised.
And this is why, germane to this topic of like, what can developers do to like, just get their feet a little bit more wet about security stuff. At least there's, I was just at KubeCon, what was it, just 2 weeks ago? Time flies when you're something. And there was quite a few sessions around something called SALSA or SLSA, which are 4 levels, at least now, defined as like what you should do. And I'm probably going to get this wrong, but trying to remember the work you're already doing. So the first level of SLSA or SALSA basically says have scripted builds. I think. I looked this up yesterday, so I think I have that right. And scripted builds are supposed, like, why would you script those? Because you want them to be repeatable. Like, you also want them to be documented in some way, shape, or form, that, not just a human being can press buttons the wrong way someday, but like that it can be repeatably run day after day, or as necessary to build to rebuild the. So that to me is one of those situations. They're like signed commits, which is later on in the SALSA requirements. These are things that you don't have to forcibly impose on people. They're probably already doing some of it. Probably not so much the signed commits. Depends on what vertical and what your developer team is doing. But that concept of like a scripted build, like, who doesn't have that? It's a bash script. It's, except for like there are some people who don't actually have that. So, but that's one of the things that I see a lot of development teams way past that stage already. And it's like, congratulations, you got your first level badge already. Like, take that exhaust or that what otherwise it's not a waste, but like waste streams into value streams, right? Be able to reframe, like Mark was saying, and say like, here's a new thing. It doesn't require you to do new things, but it does make you more aware that what you're doing has an effect and has an implication of security in it. And in this case, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Not just a bad thing, not just whacking them for bad stuff when it happens.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. So, we've spoken here about the devs, and we asked, what's the best time to do secure development training? Now, one of the insights that came out is it's not necessarily consistent across the board when developers would like to get some of the secure development training. I mean, there's some things for sure. If you look at, do I want to get secure development training after a bug report? Not really. That's not the right time. But cloud config, maybe even after the results of a threat model. A lot of them said during the coding and implementation, which is a lot of the contextual stuff we were talking about. There are things in here during the architecture and design of our software as well. And so this now brings up almost like, there are different groups of developers. We've got architectors, coders, testers, and I'm lumping, development really in sort of a broad category here, but they're not all looking to get the training at the same time. An AppSec engineer might come in and say, we need to do this when we're dealing with requirements or when we're doing coding and implementation. But if you go and you approach somebody else that maybe is a coder, that may not be the right time for them. And I'd like to sort of pick on this a little bit. And Mark, I'd like to get your take. You really are coming in from that perspective of what's the user looking to do, and how do we make it easy for them, whether psychologically or whether in their context of what they're doing day to day. Can you talk a little bit, and maybe our data, was unique, but offer your thoughts on this. Are you finding that you almost have to tailor the learning experience from an adoption standpoint based on where each of these happen within like DevOps, let's say?
I think if I had my way, we would never be adding security training at any stage of the development process. There would just be the company's magic recipe for doing awesome software development, and woven into that magic recipe for awesome software development that leaders at all levels are practicing would be that company's brand of security measures or security considerations, right next to accessibility, right next to UX design or whatever. And then it's not a security person delivering security training at any point in the workflow. It's just the company has adopted their best practices for integrating security into development in a way that makes most sense to them. I guess my number one message, and I'm not sure if that's coming across clearly, is that if security is one more thing that someone has to do, and it's not mandatory, it's just going to be that awkward thing that sometimes gets done and sometimes doesn't get done. For me, the integration of security has to be just part of the way popular people, influential people that other people look up to at that company just needs to be woven into how they're doing it. We don't call it security unless a regulator pops in and says, hey, can you prove that you're doing security stuff? At which point we pull out that list of things that we do and we highlight the aspects of security that are just woven into it. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's my perspective.
Sounds good. Tanya, I see you nodding your head. You want to add some thoughts to this?
Oh, I was looking at the platform to see, is there a way for me to do an applause and cheers and yay? Sir, I am right there with you. That is my religion. We need to find a way to get security baked into the DNA of how we engineer things. And it's not there. And this idea that, now we do our secure development training. It's like, no. It needs to be a part of the conversation as we're defining requirements, right? What are the requirements for this product? How are we going to achieve them? What are the, and how are we going to make sure this is secure? And what is the customer's expectation for security? That's so important. And then architecture. Okay, how are we going to do this architecture? Right? So it's not like there's a point in time when now we get our secure development training. That's just a myth. That is a fallacy. And that's why I always go back to we need to get it into the DNA of every engineer or developer. It needs to be a part of just how they think. We have to get it in the mindset. It can't be the add-on. And unfortunately today it's still an add-on, right? And as a company, especially someone in product security assurance, it's a huge challenge for us because we already have these engineers at varying levels in their career where it's not a part of the DNA. It's not a part of how they do that. So we have to find ways to plug it in. And the secure development training is one of the ways you try to plug it in. It's not a good solution. It's one of the solutions we have. Other methods are you should be pairing, right, your developers with someone who does have that security mindset and make it an active part. Let's design this component together and let's talk through some of these decisions. You have to find ways to embed it into just kind of how they work and how they think. And it's not easy, right? Once they've been doing this engineering for years and now they join your company and you have a different expectation for security, how do you kind of step that back and get that embedded into how they do it? It's a big challenge with no good solution. And unfortunately, this secure development training is part of the common attempt, but it can't be your only solution. It can't be your only method. You won't achieve your goals if that's your only method.
Yeah, interesting. So we have some comments that are coming in. Yes, what Mark is saying, it has to be part of the culture and responsibility of the developers. So great comment. Also, the dev teams have to be given the space and the time to engage with it and own it for delivery, which means that the product owners and the project managers have to expect and respect it. Paul, you want to take it away? You've got thoughts and comments?
Yeah, that's actually somebody on my team. Oops. I don't mean to be seeding the conversation. That was not me. On the other hand, the point is really well taken. First off, Mark, you have now another fan. But the other part is going back to I want to put a little pressure though on that topic before raising the product owner product manager responsibility here. I do think training is important. I don't think training that's a checkbox that is driven by compliance. Everybody must have this minimum level of hours. I mean, yes, there are some things that are really important. Going through corporate training does expose you to things you otherwise might not do. A mandate, though, that thou shalt go through this without actually a plan to apply it, to have follow-ups, to understand if the training turned into actual learning, which turned into actual useful. There's no, in the model of the training as a checkbox, there's no improvement cycle built into that thing. So that's a problem. That would be, any training like that is a problem for me. But I do think that people learn differently, right? Some people love to read text. Some people like to watch videos. Some people like live interaction, still like the old phone calls as opposed to the texts, right? So that I just wanted to say, like, there are different learning paths, and if there isn't somebody who can train other people, it can leave some folks out, right, that need hands-on. So yeah, go
Mark.
for it, Mark.
Sorry, I just want to throw one thing out there, and this is just terms to Google, right? So get a red hot poker and open up my eyes. It's so boring. Employee Perceptions of Cybersecurity Training is a paper that was published in 2021.
Yeah.
It's findable in Google Scholar. Red hot poker are the core keywords. That paper demonstrates that the kind of training, the one size fits all training that appeases regulators, but doesn't actually tailor security considerations to employee problems, can actually cause worse security behavior. Like, imagine if you work in a place where it's your job to send confidential information to clients, and every time you do, your system tells you that you've broken a security rule, but you know it's not true. It's your job to do this, and your boss is making you do it. But then you receive this training that says that's not allowed. That can actually cause you to resist and act insecurely. So I'm a huge proponent of trying to help, like, integrate security considerations into what everybody's doing that's cool. And if anybody wants to, like, look at some peer-reviewed research about what happens when you apply a one-size-fits-all approach to integrating training into the workplace just to appease regulators, those keywords again, red hot poker, you can find it in Google Scholar. That's it for me for now.
Yeah. And there
on
lies
that
the
note,
challenge. Yeah,
there are
the
one or
difference between. Go ahead, Paul.
There are one or two things. So, like, what else, right? Like, let's not do that. So, what are some ways that the first thing is require signed commits. Oops, but now people can't push their commits. And so, oops, right? But that's a good thing, but it's also like you're putting something in the way of something, which sometimes is necessary. There's also way before there's stuff to commit, going back to that comment about product owners and managers have to expect and respect that. Imagine in the strange world that we live in, where people don't consider the security angles that they need to do in order to write their stories. So they're writing these stories, if Agile or whatever, right? They're writing the prerequisites for building the thing, and they're not taking a security angle on it. So guess what? If you do estimates or not, but you're trying to guess, like, okay, how long is this going to take me, right? And how big is this work? And you're not factoring in some important, not only your work additional to that, but other people that need to have feedback on that. Now, all of a sudden, if you do estimates, your estimates are wildly off because all prediction in the future is bullcrap. So, but like, there's still a need to kind of factor this stuff into your stories and your plans beforehand, because when you're not doing that, it's almost like you're robbing Peter pay Paul. You're kind of you're shoving that down the way, and then it becomes a bigger time and costlier situation. So I think you know, like, its impact on estimates, not having security in that conversation, or performance or reliability, or the observability work that you have to do, or the testability of your system. There's a lot of abilities, right? But or itties. But security is definitely a gap that I would say in the estimation process. And then also in the build and release process, we're seeing a lot of changes in the way that the attestations are signed, that these artifacts are actually being validated at each stage. And so, you know, things like in toto, we're kind of looking at stuff like that to figure out, you know, why isn't this more of a germane thing to do, to make sure that as things are transitioning from this set of hands to those set of hands to this set of hands, that there's at least some things in place that when it's the right time, we can apply to ensure that, like, things don't leak, right? That if the organization has a specific security stance or policy on particular, you know, a singular build node not, you know, compromised, right? That can be a big problem. That those are in place, and that people have to respect those things, which sounds a little like that push down from a security group up on high mandate. But if you're not going to stake your claim and say organizational policy says this about risk or security, and then actually implement that as not just training that people can ignore, but actual mechanisms in your delivery process, then what are you doing? Sorry, I said a lot there.
So no, all good. So Tanya, you want to add some thoughts to this?
Yeah, so one of the things I don't know that everyone understands, and this isn't true for all industries, but when it comes to this mandatory security training, right? One of the reasons this exists, and it's not just regulatory, because by the way, there's very little legislation around security. That's a reality. Privacy, there's a whole pile of it, but around security, there is not as much. But one of the things that happens, especially in kind of the high-tech enterprise world, is we get questionnaires from our customers. So, and this is at every company I've been to. Your high-end enterprise customers, as well as federal government, send you these questionnaires, and it can be 200 questions or more, right? Asking about the security posture of your corporate network infrastructure, how you protect data, blah, blah, blah. But then they also get into your products and how you develop your products. What are your secure development practices? And a very common question is, do you have mandatory training for your developers on secure development? And then they also go as so far as, do you have role-specific training for your developers, i.e., do you have special security training for architects versus your programmers versus your quality people? And every company wants to check that box and say yes. Now, here we're seeing that this mandatory training from our own developers is not considered highly effective, right? It's not highly valued, yet our customers require it. So your security team is in this position of, we want to say yes to our customers. We know it's maybe not the most effective solution, but do we want to check the box? So I think part of the culture shift that needs to happen is we need to help educate our own companies that are sending out these questionnaires and asking these questions on, you know, what are better questions to ask, as well as the burdens on us to try to, you know, say to our customers, well, we don't require exactly that, but this is what we do instead to assure that, you know, security is a part of our foundational practices. So that's just one of the reasons why I think people see this mandatory training. And I don't know that everyone has that context of one of the things that motivates it.
Yeah, that's interesting perspective. I mean, I'd like to just go to Spencer in a moment. We've spoken about the cultural side of it. You know, developers are looking for contextual learning, really. Difference between learning and training. Training, you know, it's not just a one-time hit and we're done, but you're essentially ingrained into the day-to-day work that's being done. And it becomes a set of principles that we can now adhere to as we continue to build out secure software. Spencer, what are some things operationally that can be done to ensure that the value that is being provided to developers from the perspective of security continues to remain relevant, right? Sometimes I'll hear, for example, the security team doesn't really understand. And again, the intent of this is not to knock one team against the other. It's to try to understand, right? It's to empathize with both sides. Security teams really don't understand what I'm going through to try and release this. And at the same time, we've got security folks coming in and saying, I'd really love to help, but I don't know that I'm being adequately heard or understood. Crossing this bridge, training is one mechanism, ongoing learning. And we've spoken about many different ways that could be approached. But, it's come up so often in our conversation, this idea of embedding this into the culture. Can you talk a little bit about the guardrails from a cultural standpoint that could be put in place to ensure that this value that security provides is embraced by developers, it's valuable, and it's just an ongoing thing, just very natural?
Yeah, and so a lot into this question. I think the first thing is that it really depends on what we like categorize as training. So like the way that we do it, we've got like open-ended type training that gets like general awareness, like people understand like, oh, security is a thing. These are the types of vulnerabilities that we may have. These are what they might manifest into. Like this is all great contextual awareness, like be cognizant that there is a problem. Doesn't necessarily translate directly to like actual something that I'm working on at that time, but it gets them aware that, oh yeah, there's a problem, and that there's like this unique class of development challenges that is interesting. Most developers find like development problems interesting. Security problems are yet another class. So I see like that, and we at Reddit we will classify like that is our mandatory training, like getting people that awareness rather than like check the box, like here's a very dry, like we're going to go through all the acronyms that exist in security. Like, no, we don't want to do that. We want to get people at least aware. And so that is what I will classify as training on those terrible, terrible questionnaires that I will knock compliance teams because they lack that empathetic understanding of like what is going on. So if there's any team we're going to knock, it's going to be compliance. But joking aside, I think the interesting bit is then what do you do with the actual developer that's writing stuff at real time? So, there's plenty of patterns that exist that AppSec teams have used. Like there's the paved paths that Netflix has used. There's the library pattern that I think OWASP recommends. Like there's a lot of different ways to solve that problem. And this is where a security practitioner has to have that empathetic listening. You have to meet a developer on their terms to understand what is useful, how does it work, what's the biggest bang for the buck, because there's a lot of challenges that are affecting an AppSec engineer's rollout of this as well. At Reddit, we're an underdog team. Like we don't have 1,000 people to just deploy everywhere and say, okay, let's do AppSec. I'm looking at like, how do I scale this? How do I make it reproducible? How do I remove the human from the element? And all of those things are going to go into the understanding of how am I building guardrails that helps codify these things that have happened. And if there are people challenges, then fine, I will write specific training. So like we've got a training course here at Reddit that says these are the typical classes. Like I look at our bug bounty, I look at various input sources that gives me good data-driven reasons for why I'm giving this training, rather than just like here's the whole OWASP top 10. I hate the OWASP top 10 training. Like specific training is so great because every company has like where those weak points are, right? Like at Reddit, it's auth because our auth is terrible on the inside. But I can combat that by getting people aware of like, these are the contextual problems. This is what this looks like. When you see this type of behavior, come reach out to us. Security is there to help give you a second pair of eyes and create that relationship. So I really view, security training or those guardrails, you have to pick and choose your battles, looking at scale, looking at the things that are repeatable, anything that I can like CSRF, not a problem at Reddit. It's built into all of our web frameworks that we expand across. You just have to figure out how to meet the developer on those terms. And then that is where the major value add is, which requires you to understand, again, that empathetic listening. Unless you know how the other half lives, you're not going to be super effective.
Yeah. Paul, you were going to add a comment in this?
Yeah, question, Spencer. And it's okay if you can't answer, but there are some things that I've seen in various different situations internally, like to raise internal awareness and advocate for something to get better from a culture or tech perspective. And those things are like office hours, right? Just being open and available. It's a fortune cookie kind of thing to say, make it easy to do the right things, make it hard to do the wrong things. But like as a spirit, like as a semi North Star, if I can put that out there, then that means that like you do have to, if you care about this thing, you do have to run things like, maybe even some dojos. So between the paved or golden paths, the library, like you mentioned, CSRF, but specifically about things like office hours, do you find that effective? Have you done that
Yeah.
before?
Yeah, so Reddit, we actually used to have office hours until no one kept coming to them, and so we discontinued them. So but we had an office hours culture 2 or 3 years ago when I joined, and now that has kind of died off. I think, again, this goes into, as a security team, you should figure out like how does the engineering org
Yep.
work and operate. And when I'm looking at how do we want to implement things, I'm never thinking, oh, let's do this because we're different. We have a different security process. Like, no, if we're going to do vuln management and we're going to open up tickets, let's make sure it goes through the same ticket triage process that the rest of the engineering org looks like, right? Like, I want to look exactly like QA, looks exactly like defects that are found like I want to be as normal as possible from a security perspective. So I think the challenge here is that you just have to figure out how to meet them at that point. And so like what we have evolved to today is we now have a GitHub. We're a very GitOps oriented group. And so we have a GitHub team that like, if you need a code review, just tag somebody in. And people like, we know the different leads and the EMs, and we've got a really great relationship with our engineering culture, which, it's hard and not everybody gets that luxury. I'm sorry for folks that don't have that. It's awesome though, so strive for it. But that's what we've evolved into, because we now like we've got enough contextual information that, oh yeah, we can pop into a PR and be like, oh cool, or we'll hang out in particular Slack threads or channels that we know that, when people have these types of issues, more than likely, like I had somebody asking the other day, like, how do I store basic auth passwords for this thing that they were going to implement? And I was like, hold on, you said a lot of red flags there. Let's figure out how we can actually do this and accomplish what you're trying to do. And that was just by me lurking in a Slack channel. So you just got to figure out what is that right mechanism to there's no one-stop shop answer, but you got to figure out, try a lot of things. Like I tried so many things when I first started, and eventually you weed those things out. You pick what's good. You get feedback from execs. It's a continually evolving process. So if your security team is doing that, then awesome. If they're not, plant that seed so that they can start, just like any other team, you should be iterating and getting better. Security should be doing the same darn thing.
Yeah, let me just pop a question to Mark. Yeah, Mark, go ahead. You had a comment?
Oh, right. Well, I was actually just going to feed off something Spencer said. I love the idea of bug bounty or other competitions that like naturally draw out people who are really interested in trying to break things or fix them. There's a lot of great research out there. If you look at adversarial emulation teams, so red teams compared with threat hunters. So there are different types of people that are fundamentally more attractive to breaking things or fixing things and protecting things than others. And when you have a one-size-fits-all training program, be it regulatory driven or whatever, what you're actually doing is targeting everyone as if they're the same, which can get frustrating, as we've already discussed. But when you have organic, cool, gamified, competitive style activities like bug bounty set up on the side, what you're doing is you're putting something up that is attractive to people who naturally gravitate towards it. And what you find when you give people the opportunity to volunteer for stuff like that, you get some really incredible output. And then the people who aren't super into it, they just do their job normally. So I don't know, it's really cool. What were you going to ask, Altaz?
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask a question around the diversity of that technical pool of people that we've got. How do you manage to create a culture with that diversity and embracing that diversity? Because what Spencer was talking about earlier was what someone does maybe on the architecture side can have an impact on what somebody does on the development side, but we're still trying to adhere to the same principles when it comes to security. So how do you go about managing and embracing that diversity and not really trying to fragment security, which is part of the problem we have today, right? We've got code scanners for coders, and we've got pen testing for this, and it's like different pieces of data across. But how do we kind of bring this together to say ultimately we've got one common goal that we're trying to strive for? Do you have any thoughts on that, Mark?
I mean, I do, at the risk of sounding like a broken record or dating myself. I mean, like an MP3 that's stuck, it's really less about the security being an obvious part of what we do and more about weaving it into like what's normalized, right? Like, honestly, the more time we spend trying to make sure that security is a separate, independent activity that, we raise our hands when it's conducted,
Yeah.
the more we isolate it. And the more it's us as security professionals promoting it, the less popular it becomes. So, I guess the simple way to answer the question you actually asked is like, I would look at how the organization already diversifies its expectations of various groups and then model that, right? It's not like not all web development or not all developer areas are the same. You customize ongoing expectations and training needs and requirements as a function of each group. And then like the security just needs to add on to that. It doesn't need to be an extra thing that everybody does. It needs to be woven in to the customized training and other activities, I think, that people are already doing. I'm not sure if that makes sense or if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I'd like to actually just go to Tanya for a moment. You opened up this conversation early on and talked about hardware engineers, people that deal with firmware, and then we've got these web applications and DevOps, and it moves really quickly. And now we're talking about developers that may in fact operate at different cadences. We don't necessarily at the firmware level release multiple times a day. Can you offer some thoughts on integrating and trying to talk about security when you've got these two different ways of developing?
Yeah, and Altes, you and I talked about this. To say that there's software security and AppSec engineering and to look at it from kind of one angle is, we're doing ourselves a disservice. When my firmware engineers see security training and they cover OWASP top 10, their eyes all roll over. And you want to talk about the red poker to the eyeballs? Put a bunch of firmware engineers in your typical security training you find online, and the vast majority of it is just, even if it's relevant in terms of the principles, they're not able to make that contextual leap. How do I apply this example that's given to me from the perspective of a web app to firmware, right? They just can't make that leap. So, I think it's, as Mark and several people pointed out here, there's no one size fits all model. There's no one single set of training. We have to have training that is specific to the types of things our people do, because to expect them to do the mental gymnastics of, well, I can kind of understand the concept and see the example for web, and I can translate that to how that applies now to what I do in firmware, you're asking too much of them, right? So we need to have specific examples that are tailored to what they do, that are done in the context of what they do it. And that's hard because there's a huge amount of variation in terms of the types of software development and the problems our engineers are facing. But we need to get there. And one of the things we talked about, Altes, is we need to get to more reusable widgets, if you will, right? Widgets that are vetted and architected with security in mind, et cetera, and it comes down to integration. So this isn't just about solving the problem from a training perspective or a checklist perspective. It's how can we get smarter about how we do some of these things? We shouldn't all be re-engineering and re-engineering the wheel with every product development. It should be vetted component that does this, that we know satisfies our security objectives. Drop it in, configure it, and use it and go. But overall, our training is not where it needs to be. And I'll say it again, we've got to get this baked into every university course with respect to engineering should have security as a part of every chapter and every topic. And if we did that, we'd get closer to it just being how we think about the problems, not the add-on.
Interesting. And I see we're coming up against time. So what I'd like to do is afford each one of you maybe 30 seconds to go in and offer any final thoughts. Maybe there are things that we haven't talked about. Maybe you've got some pointers, links, things that you would like to bring out and let the community know about. I'm going to start with Paul, then we'll go to Mark, Spencer, and Tanya. So Paul, you want to kick it off?
Sure. So first thing is I'm a curious person. I'm curious, but and a creative person. And not everybody feels like they're creative or curious. The thing is, that can be developed. That's what I do, right? I encourage the creativity and curiosity of people and engineers, and I know that it can happen. So my message to people who are watching this, especially the frontline devs, is bring the pain forward. Do some stuff yourself, like use your own account. Don't use company or corporate stuff. Like use your own thing, run a sample app on a Kubernetes cluster or something, and you'll see how quickly security becomes a very important thing for your account, right? It is a very important thing for a reason. So like play around with things yourself, get curious, try things out in a semi-safe place. And if you want to know more, just DM me on LinkedIn or some other channel, and we can connect up and talk about that. But really own your own journey, right? It's learn things because you're curious, not because somebody's telling you you have to. So
sounds good. Thanks, Paul. And Mark, we'll go over to you. You have any final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Altaz and everybody. This has been great. I mean, in one sentence, you need to give people the training they require as they require it. And that's it, right? And the simple example is, does everybody need to learn how to like write MySQL coding in a way that makes it safe and like prevents SQL injection? Probably not. Probably the people who are actually coding in SQL need to actually follow whatever guidelines they've been given about how to code. And those guidelines should include whatever syntactical things that their supervisors or leadership has approved, and woven into those things that have been approved should be things that prevent SQL injection. That is my best example. If anybody wants to talk to me about how we could seamlessly integrate behavioral science interventions into things that they're doing, please drop me a line. That's it. Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. And Spencer, we'll go over to you. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the thing that would be so beneficial from a developer standpoint is to come forward with examples of things that have been security bugs. Like if you have seen something or you've picked up patterns or like you've stumbled across things that are tangentially related to security, the reason why our security training sucks so bad is because it's hard to tailor to every single language, every single framework, every single like way development actually happens. And so if you start building a body of like, oh, these are the things that I've been seeing, that is the best training. And I would love to be able to sit through that, but it's just so hard to curate. And that's where this partnership really grows from a security perspective, when we start understanding like what are these common pitfalls. So be kind to your security person. They're also like having a hard time as well, figuring out how we can share and like build up that body of knowledge. That's a good path forward. Thanks, y'all.
Great. And Tanya, final thoughts?
You know, I think with the developers in mind, right, thinking of this as developer focused, every developer can play a role in security without any centralized team or function telling them, do this, right? Whenever you're meeting with your peers and you guys are discussing, okay, what are the requirements to this? How are we going to implement this? What does our architecture look like? At every one of those conversations, just be the guy to go, hey, what about security? Is there something we need to worry about? Is there some data that could potentially be leaked that maybe we need to talk about how we're going to protect it? Is there some path that someone could come in to get to something they shouldn't be able to get to? What do we need to protect? What do we need to think about? And I think just having that prompt and asking that question, and also to what Spencer was saying, you know, asking yourself and revisiting with the team, hey, here are some defects we had in the past that had to do with security. You know, do we need to do anything to prevent these in this next generation or this next release or this next product? Just sitting there and asking the question as you're looking at and doing your engineering work, what about security? Will shift your brain to maybe look at the problem differently or look at the solution differently.
That's great. Wonderful. And that brings us now to the end of today's webinar. A big thank you to all of you, our panelists. Thanks to all of you who attended as well. Please feel free reach out to any of the panelists if you'd like to. You can also visit Security Compass at securitycompass.com. If you've got any ideas for upcoming webinars and you'd like to have us share some insights and thoughts, let us know. Just email us at insights@securitycompass.com. So on behalf of all of our panelists and Security Compass, I wish all of you a safe and a happy week. Thank you and take care. Bye.